A torch moves through an olive grove at midnight, the light shaking with every step. A man walks toward Jesus and kisses him on the cheek, a student's greeting for a beloved teacher. Tonight it is a signal, not a greeting. Jesus does not pull away. He looks at the man about to sell him for the price of a slave and calls him one word: friend. He does not grab him or call the angels he could summon with a breath. He lets him walk into the dark, free, uncaught. That is the question this video answers. Jesus never once chased down anyone who chose to walk away from him. And that is the most costly kind of love there is. Let's start with a man who had everything to lose. A young Jewish official, wealthy, likely tied to a synagogue or even the ruling council, comes running to Jesus one afternoon. Running, not strolling. He drops to his knees in the dust in front of a crowd and asks the only question that actually matters. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Historians studying first-century Judea note that a man of his standing would have owned land, livestock, perhaps a share in a trade route, wealth that took generations to build. That detail matters because what Jesus asks him to give up next is not loose change. It is the whole architecture of his life. Jesus lists the commandments. The man says he has kept them all since he was a boy, and there is no reason in the text to doubt him. Mark's Gospel adds a detail most retellings skip past on their way to the sad ending. It says Jesus, looking at him, loved him, and then told him the one thing that would cost him everything he owned. Sell what you have, give it to the poor. Come, follow me. But here's what almost everyone misses about what happens to his face next. The Greek word there carries the sense of a sky going dark, weather changing in real time. He went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. He went away. And Jesus did not run after him down that dusty road. He did not shout a discount, a compromise, an easier version of the invitation. He watched a man he loved choose his money over his maker. And he let him go, grieving right alongside him, but never once grabbing his sleeve. But this wasn't even the hardest goodbye Jesus would ever face. The next one happens in front of thousands, not one man on a quiet road. In the 6th chapter of John, Jesus feeds a crowd in the thousands from 5 loaves and 2 small fish. A miracle so enormous that people try to crown him king by force right there on the hillside. Rome kept careful watch over crowds that size in an occupied province. A movement this large, moving this fast, was exactly the kind of thing that got a man arrested. This is the peak of his popularity in the entire gospel record. And then Jesus does something that looks, on the surface, like career suicide. He starts teaching something hard, language so intense that many of his own followers say, "This is a hard saying, who can bear to hear it?" And John tells us plainly, without softening it, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Watch the word choice here. It matters more than it looks. The Greek is hupago, to go away under your own will, to depart because you decided to depart. Nobody pushed them out the door. They chose the door themselves, and Jesus let it stay open behind them. Picture that crowd shrinking in real time, right in front of the 12. This is not one grieving man anymore. This is a public, humiliating exodus, the kind of moment that makes most leaders panic and start negotiating. Jesus does not negotiate. He turns to the 12, who are still standing there, and asks the most vulnerable question in the entire Gospel of John. Will you also go away? Read that again. The Son of God, standing in the wreckage of his own popularity, asks his closest friends if they are leaving too. He does not manipulate them into staying. He opens the door for them exactly as wide as he opened it for the crowd that just walked out of it. And Simon Peter, a rough Galilean fisherman who will deny even knowing Jesus before this story is finished, says the words that have echoed in churches for 2,000 years. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. What happened in a garden days later would reveal the same pattern at its highest cost. Now here's what almost nobody points out. This pattern did not start with Jesus. It goes back 1,500 years earlier to a man named Moses, standing in front of an entire nation on the edge of a wilderness they had wandered for 40 years. A generation that had already broken this same covenant once, worshipping a golden calf while Moses was still on the mountain receiving it. And even after that failure, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses stands before them again and says, in the very voice of God, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. Set before you, not forced upon you. The Hebrew word there is bahar, to choose, to select, to decide for yourself. It is the same root word Joshua uses a generation later when he gathers that same nation and says, choose you this day whom you will serve. Joshua does not stop there. He tells them plainly that if serving this God seems wrong to them, they are free to choose differently, free to serve other gods entirely. He says it and then adds his own decision anyway. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Historians who study the ancient Near East point out something else worth knowing. Most treaties in that world, the agreements between a king and his people, ran in one direction only. A conquering ruler wrote the terms and the population had no real say in the matter. The covenant structure running through the Hebrew Bible is unusual for its era because it reads less like a decree and more like a proposal. It sets out the terms and then it waits for an answer. That is the detail that should stop you. The God of the entire Bible has never once been a God who compels love. He does not write the terms and force a signature. He lays the choice down, plainly, and lets people carry the full weight of choosing it, even when he already knows how many of them will choose wrong. The same posture Jesus will hold in every story you are about to watch. Unbroken, 15 centuries before he was ever born in Bethlehem. Now the pattern turns personal. A father has two sons. The younger one walks up to his own living father and says essentially, I wish you were already dead. Give me my inheritance now. In that culture, this request sat one step short of spitting in a parent's face. And the father, in the story Jesus tells in the 15th chapter of Luke, does not lecture him, does not lock the gate, does not call in favors around the village to keep the estate intact. He divides his living between them. He hands the boy exactly what he asked for and watches him walk down the road toward a far country, carrying everything the father spent a lifetime building. This is not one man's soul anymore, and it is not a crowd's loyalty. This is a father watching his own child choose to leave the family itself. That is grief with a face on it. Every parent who has stood at a doorway watching a grown child walk out with a suitcase knows exactly what that father felt. The son loses everything in that far country. A famine hits. He ends up feeding pigs, an unthinkable job for a Jewish man, hungry enough to eye the food meant for the animals. And he decides to go home not as a son, but as a hired servant, just to survive. But here's what almost everyone misses in this parable. Luke says the father sees him while he is still a long way off, which means someone had been watching that road, day after day, for however long the boy was gone. And the moment the father sees him, the text says he runs. The same father who let his son walk away without a single word of protest now picks up the hem of his own robe. In a culture where a grown man running in public was considered beneath his dignity, and sprints the whole distance to meet him. This is the key that unlocks everything you have watched tonight. The father never chased his son into the far country, but the second that son turned around, the father ran the whole distance to close the gap himself. That is not a contradiction. That is the same love wearing two different faces, patient enough to let you leave, desperate enough to run the moment you turn back toward home. Now the stakes climb again. past a family, past a crowd, into something with the power to kill. Fast forward to the final week of Jesus' life. He stands in front of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, a man with the legal authority to release him on the spot. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century in Antiquities of the Jews, describes just how unusual it was for any rabbi of that era to lose followers without a fight. Most teachers pursued their students, argued them back, leaned on their own authority to keep a movement from bleeding away in public. Here's where Jesus breaks the pattern of every rabbi around him. He does the opposite all the way to the end. There's a detail in this trial almost everyone skips. Roman governors in that era held a custom of releasing one prisoner at Passover to keep an occupied city calm. Pilate hands the crowd an actual choice, an actual door, and offers it twice, hoping they will choose differently the second time. He all but begs Jesus to defend himself. Jesus stays almost entirely silent. He does not perform a miracle to sway the crowd. He does not call down the angels he mentioned back in that garden. He lets the crowd choose a convicted insurrectionist named Barabbas over him, and he does not argue with their choice. This is not a trial he lost control of, not a plan that fell apart, not a God caught off guard by human freedom. This is the same pattern you have watched all through this video, scaled to its highest possible cost. The thing being let go is no longer a young man's wealth or a crowd's approval, it is his own life. And this is where we go back to the garden and where that word friend finally makes sense. You remember the torchlight. You remember the kiss. You remember Jesus calling the man about to hand him over to death by one word, and you have been waiting this whole video to know why. His name was Judas Iscariot, treasurer of the 12, the only disciple not from Galilee. Historians believe he came from a town called Kerioth in Judea, which may be where his name comes from. He had walked with Jesus for 3 years. He had watched water become wine, a blind man's eyes open. He had eaten the bread Jesus multiplied with his own hands. And for 30 pieces of silver, the exact price the law of Moses assigned to a slave, he chose to sell his teacher to the men who wanted him dead. Scholars still argue over why. Some point to greed, since John's Gospel says he kept the group's money bag and skimmed from it. Others point to disillusionment, a man who expected a political king and got a suffering servant instead, and could not forgive the difference. Either way, the choice was his. Nothing in the text suggests Jesus manipulated the outcome. Judas walked toward that decision with open eyes, one ordinary choice at a time, for 3 years. Here's what should stop you cold. Jesus knew long before that night. Earlier that same evening, at the table, he looked directly at Judas and said, "What you are about to do quickly." Not a threat, not a plea, almost a release, like a father who knows he cannot stop the car in the driveway and chooses instead to say the truest thing he can before the door closes for good. So when Judas walks up in that garden, torch in hand, soldiers behind him, and presses his lips to the cheek of the man who has loved him for 3 years, Jesus does not call him traitor, does not call him fool. He calls him friend, a word that costs Jesus everything to say and costs Judas nothing to hear, because Judas already made up his mind before he crossed the garden gate. Not wealth, not popularity, not even family, his own life handed over by his own friend, in the dark, with a kiss. And still, Jesus does not chase him into the shadows to stop him. Think of a parent standing on a porch at 2 in the morning, porch light on, watching a grown child's taillights disappear down the street for what might be the last time. You do not run down the driveway screaming after the car. Some part of you knows that chasing it would not bring them home. It would only prove you never believed they were free to begin with. So you leave the light on instead. You leave the door unlocked. You let the choice be real, because love that has to force you to stay was never strong enough to be worth staying for. That is the porch light burning in every story you have watched tonight. The rich young man walking down that road. The crowd walking back into their old lives. The prodigal walking toward the far country. Judas walking into the dark with soldiers at his back. Jesus never runs after a single one of them. Not because he does not care, but because chasing them would have stolen the only thing that makes love mean anything at all: the freedom to have said no. You have now watched this pattern hold across a wealthy young man, a hillside crowd in the thousands, a family split down the middle, a Roman court with the power to kill, and a garden with a kiss in it. 5 settings, 5 kinds of loss, one posture that never changes. Jesus does not become more controlling as the stakes rise. If anything, he becomes quieter, gentler, more willing to let the moment be exactly what the other person chooses to make it. And that same door is standing open right now, in front of you. He is not going to force it. He never has. But if he loved a man enough to call him friend on the very night that man sold him for the price of a slave, then there has never been a version of you too far gone to still be called by that same word. The porch light is still on. It has been on this whole time you have been watching. And it is not going out. Not for the ones who walked away tonight, and not for you.